Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our lectures in the study of public international law. In this lecture, what we're going to be doing is spending some time talking about the history of international law. Now, I've divided this up into two distinct lectures. This one will be concerning the history of international law from around the 1400s up to the start of the First World War in 1914. The second will be looking at modern international law, and we will be examining the history from 1914 to the present day. The reason for this is very simple. It's because the length of time this lecture would have been if I put them both together as one big lecture would be far too long to record and far too long for somebody to sit through and watch. So I'm going to do them in two different distinct topics. And I want to begin with the 1960s historian E.H. Carr, who, in the 1960s, this historian of the Soviet Union, compiled a series of lectures opining on the theory and the practice of history itself. Sometimes referred to as the study of historiography, his study of what is history became one of the most foundational texts in this area. And Carr noted that the historian is necessarily selective. The belief in a hard core of historical facts existing objectively and independently of the interpretation of the historian is a preposterous fallacy, but one which is very hard to eradicate. Fundamentally then, Carr's thoughtful and insightful analysis leads one to the conclusion that history is first and foremost, quote, a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts. A history cannot be objective on this account, since facts are objective. History involves something more. It is not just facts. History is the interrelationship between the facts as stated and the individual who is actually doing the history, which involves the selecting of facts, the interpreting of the facts in a manner which produces a historical account of the past. What then can be said about the history of international law? Well, in this regard, the same rules apply. The history of international law is similar to any other kind of history. It is what you choose to understand and select for which will colour your interpretation of how international legal systems developed. It is here I want to begin our discussions on the history of international law. I will be providing a more formalistic and traditional lecture on the subject of its historical development a little bit later on, but I want to begin by looking at the theoretical approach to international law and thinking about theoretical approaches of examining international law through a historical lens. The study of international law in history has been an area that has seen an increasing amount of scholarship over the last few years. Matthew Craven, for example, notes that it is commonplace that the past 2 decades have been marked by a resurgence of interest in the history of international law. Marty Koskiniemi similarly notes that although little has happened in international legal history in the past half century, there have also been clear signs of an atmospheric change. The reality is that since the late 18th and early 19th century, there has been a growing recognition that all international lawyers are compelled or were compelled to conceive of their subject matter as being in time and as possessed of a history. This is likely a fact of scholarly discipline that all subjects must experience in one form or another at some point throughout the discipline's history. Perhaps one of the unique qualities of international law is the fact that its recognition as being a discipline with temporal qualities took place at a much later stage than other academic disciplines. After all, for example, the history of philosophy was as an area of study that is as old as philosophy itself, or nearly as old as philosophy itself, dating back to the works of Aristotle, documenting the history of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the people like Thales and Anaximander and Pythagoras. An immediate noteworthy consideration of the history of international law must be that it clearly has to confine to the lens of which it comes from, this lens being, of course, the European lens through which it is viewed. The foundations of international law, or the law of nations, as it is understood today, lie firmly in the development of Western culture and political organisation. The growth of European notions of sovereignty and independent nation-states required an acceptable method whereby interstate relations could be conducted in accordance with commonly accepted standards of behaviour, and international law filled this gap that began to exist, this lacuna that began to exist in relation to the ways in which interstate relations could be conducted in accordance with commonly accepted standards of behaviour. Of course, the waging of war was historically the commonly accepted standards of behaviour. This has started to die out over the years. Now, while Shaw here presents a very Eurocentric interpretation of the history of international law, it is doubtless the case that he is correct in a number of his assertions. It should also be noted that Koskiniemi discusses arguably a conception of modern international law, but frames the discussion in a way which stipulates or situates the clearly difficult to examine elephant in the room. This elephant in the room is, of course, the legacy of colonialism. Quote, Europeans still acted from a position of superiority to others. Capitulation regimes, consular jurisdiction, and brutal colonial wars had become banal aspects of the international everyday. Advancing civilization oppressed and impoverished indigenous populations to the point of extinction, a fact accepted by imperial powers as an inevitable consequence of modernity. And so with this in mind, and in continuing to theorize about the history of international law, it is important that we recognize that indigenous populations, academics and scholars of the global south, and the increasing generation of critical and third world scholars of international law would have to face an uphill battle when it comes to telling their history. A history that does not exist off the back of colonial domination, but is rather a product of it. This is, of course, thinking about the legacy of imperialism. The legacy of imperialism, then, becomes itself a lens through which one has to understand not just the history of international law, but has to understand really all aspects of this subject to this day. So when we study international humanitarian law or international economic law, we're going to have to think about ideas of colonialism and ideas of its history in a similar sense. As understood by Anthony Anghie, for example, some of the most central concerns of international legal theorizing cannot be properly explored without taking imperialism into account. International law, therefore, consisted of a set of rules with a geographical basis. It was a European law, a religious ethical inspiration, it was a Christian law, an economic motivation, it was a mercantilist law, and political aims, it was an imperialist law. This is a very fundamental point of the history of international law, and one that you can't overlook. And so when we think about the history of international law from a more traditionalist perspective, as we'll get to in a second, I want to make it very clear that embedded and imbued throughout all of this conversation will be this idea of imperialism and colonialism and the relationship between different states from global north and global south from a Eurocentric perspective versus from a more global-centric perspective. And so when asking the question of, well, what is the point in spending so long drilling this conceptualization of the history of international law, as one, to quote former Israeli Foreign Secretary Shlomo Ben-Ami, as being born in sin, well, the suggestion is that the foundations of international law were not created in a vacuum. Fundamentally, they were established with a particular goal in mind. They had a particular end goal, a particular telos, if you will, which had a uniquely European, a uniquely Western, a uniquely capitalist, and a uniquely imperialist character to it. This characteristic, then, of international law and her history is one that can still be seen to this day, and when we go through the history of international law in this lesson, you will see this being very clearly prevalent throughout its history, but we will also see this very prevalent when we look at modern international law in the next lesson. So the point of the conclusion of this lesson might be that imperialism doesn't go away when we start thinking about the 20th century, but at the same time, we have to recognize that imperialism still existed, and it still theoretically exists to this day, just in different forms and to a lesser degree in some circumstances. So just bear that in mind when we thinking about the history of international law. And so with this basic, let's say, a theoretical approach delimited, let's start thinking about a traditional history of international law, the kind of history of international law that you might see in an ordinary textbook. And for this, then, we're going to be looking at the historical development of international law, beginning from around the 1400s onwards. This is fundamentally where we start to see the development of the system of international law as we know it today. One of the defining features of what would later develop into the Renaissance was the concept of the Age of Exploration. And this begins in around the 15th century. Here we see voyages from European powers that were undertaken by explorers such as Christopher Columbus, by Vasco da Gama, and also by Ferdinand Magellan. With this growth in discovery, we see this era emboldening European powers. These European powers included the likes of Spain and England and Portugal and France, all to basically attempt to establish overseas colonies, and all were successful in doing so. Laying the foundations of empire, then, and running in conjunction with this growth in economic expansion through imperialism, were the theoretical justifications for such expansions. And these theoretical justifications were based quite heavily on religious zeal. And it's here where I want to begin by thinking about the doctrine of discovery. This was based on papal bulls such as the 1452 Dum Divasus, as well as the 1455 Romanus Pontifex, which both granted European monarchs the right to claim lands that are inhabited by non-Christians. According again to Koskiniemi, European nations had, by all lawful means, the right to extend their settlements and authority by discovery and effective occupation in new countries. We will get to what this idea of effective occupation means later on, because that becomes a very important feature of 19th century colonialism. But this early stage of colonialism, this early stage of expanding settlements and imperial structures with things like the Romanus Pontifex in 1455, grants European monarchs the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians. And this has a number of important implications. The use of the doctrine of discovery, which was done especially by empires like Spain and Portugal, justified colonization of the Americas as well as of other regions too. And the sort of religious character of these decrees and these assertions allowed for the development of the idea that Christian nations could exert their sovereignty over non-Christian territories. We see here then a sort of first dialectic begin to exist, a first dichotomy between the Christian and the non-Christian. The Christians are able to assert their sovereignty and to assert and to dominate the non-Christian territories. This links quite heavily with another dichotomy that we begin to see emerging as well, this idea that Christianity is presented as a civilizing mission against non-Christian indigenous populations.
Further still, when we see in 1494 the Treaty of Tordesillas, this was an agreement that was brokered by Pope Alexander VI, and it essentially divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between Spain and Portugal along the Meridian line. And again, the influence of things like this treaty and the influence of the papal the influence of the papacy within this broader conversation is important to note, because it further cements the papal authority, but more theoretically, it further cements the Christian legitimacy in matters concerning international relations. It becomes a foundationally Christian body of rules and regulations. It is not secular, it is steeped quite heavily in theories of natural law, which themselves are steeped quite heavily in Catholic doctrine, people like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. And within this entire conversation, the work of Francisco de Vitoria is very, very important. So Vitoria was a Spanish philosopher and a theologian who, as you can probably imagine, being in this subject on the history of international law, contributed quite a lot of developments to a more theoretical understanding of international law. His work is considered to be contributive of one of the sort of precursors of modern international law. For example, he presented what could be described as a number of quite remarkably progressive views when it came to the relationship between the so-called native population, the Indian peoples in Spanish colonies in South America. His ideas are firmly grounded in a natural law doctrine of theologians such as people like St. Thomas Aquinas. And when I say remarkably progressive, I will get to the sort of caveat and the sort of the sort of point at which we need to be quite limited in our language of progressivism. Progressive for the time doesn't necessarily mean progressive in today's standards. Vitoria's adaptation was significant for the new vision of the political community to which it was joined. His doctrine reflected a normative potential vested in a comprehensive phenomenon of human collectivists, not identified with imperialist authorities, and also distinct but inclusive of new and indigenous peoples. It's this latter part of this quote here from Gordon from the Oxford Handbook on the Theory of International Law that is really important, inclusive of, also distinct from, but inclusive of new and indigenous peoples. This idea here is essentially this idea that there was a belief in the mind of Vitoria that peoples had natural rights, and it didn't necessarily matter what type of people, in inverted commas, those communities came from. Everybody had a natural rights, and those natural rights were shared among everybody. Now, what we will see as we go through this lecture is that a number of the most important jurists within international law and its history throughout the last few centuries, they all struggle to defend or to provide an adequate justification for these early periods of imperialism and colonialism because of these basic ideas. Because while appearing utopian and remarkably progressive for the time, this is not to suggest that he believed one ought to regard indigenous communities in the same light as that of empire. According to Shaw, Vitoria by no means advocated the recognition of the Indian nations as equal to the Christian states of Europe. For him, opposing the work of missionaries in territories was not just a reason for war, a raison d'etre, and he adopted a rather extensive view as to the rights of the Spaniards in South America. So we sort of have to limit the tone of our understanding of Vitoria's progressivism when it comes to his interpretation of international law and the relationship between the colonized and the colonial powers. A bit away from this idea of natural rights and theories of natural rights, what about his other contributions to international law? Well, he contributed quite a lot to international law, as you could probably imagine. He opines, for example, on the development of the bellum justum ex equor parte principle. This was a concept of a sort of reciprocal approach to just war, the concept of a just war on both sides. This idea is very, very important since it, quote, opened the door to a non-discriminatory conception of war in which both sides had a right to wage war and enjoy the benefits of the laws of war. Now, this is a particularly uncontroversial statement about the laws of war and international humanitarian law today, but at the time at which Vittoria was writing and contributing, this was a quite revolutionary and groundbreaking principle. What we will note is that people like Vittoria and people like Hugo Grotius, people like Pufendorf, all fundamentally developed principles that were radical for their time, but are now seen as bedrocks and cornerstones of some of the basic principles of international law to this day. But what should not be taken away and what should not be forgotten about is the fact that international law is created by and is serving for one centralized concept within the international community. This is the idea of the nation state. And so when we think about the rise of the nation state and sovereignty, we have to think about, for example, the influence of the Renaissance. The Renaissance sees the rise of a centralized concept of the nation state in Europe. When we look at the monarchs of Europe, people like Louis XI in France, and we think about Henry VII in England, as well as Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, we see the strengthening of control over their domestic affairs. Henry VII, for example, took quite a lot of personal control over all aspects of internal domestic policy within England. This is partially because he found himself to be mistrustful of the nobility. Anybody who has a basic understanding of sort of early Tudor history will know that the reign of Henry VII marks an end to the Wars of the Roses, which begins in around 1450 and ends either, if you want to agree with the sort of basic conception, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 or the Battle of Stochfield in 1487. But fundamentally, there were a lot of people who were challenging the reign of Henry VII, and Henry VII recognized that stability was key to maintaining his dynasty. And so he kept a very tight leash, should I say, over a number of his nobles. And he was successful in doing so. His dynasty becomes one of the most famous dynasties throughout all of history, the Tudor dynasty. So the rise of the nation state then would begin to see a shift in the balance of power in Europe, with a greater emphasis on the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty, defined as the idea that each state has exclusive control over its territory and the authority to enter into relations with other states, would inform the foreign policies of this period of European history. And we can see this with a number of international treaties existing around the time at which all of these different monarchs were in power. We see, for example, the treaties which were concerning marriage alliances. Treaty of Medina del Campo between Henry VII of England and Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This was a treaty which essentially married Henry's oldest son, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon. And, of course, for those of you, again, who know a little bit about Tudor history, you will remember that this doesn't go quite very well because they get married, but then Prince Arthur dies unexpectedly, and the Treaty of Medina del Campo starts to break down. And it's only until after the death of Henry VII in 1509 that his second son, Henry VIII, marries Catherine of Aragon, and a whole host of major problems happens with regard to that particular marriage alliance that took place there. Another example of treaties existing was the Treaty of Etaples between England and France. This was a peace treaty after a war with Brittany, as well as trade and commerce treaties between England and places like the Netherlands, like the Intercursus Malus. Another contributing factor to the rise of the modern system of the state and sovereignty is the slow decline of feudalism in Europe. This is because before the emergence of the nation state, feudalism was largely the governing pathology of Europe. This was a decentralized system of political organization in which power would be fragmented among local lords, vassals, and other territorial authorities. This is one of the major periods of medieval history. And according to Russian international lawyer Evgeny Trumfonovich, the decline of feudalism coincides, in fact, with the development of capitalism, and by extension, this modern development of international law. His theory of international law incorporates a theory of periodization, where we see, quote, proceeding from the mistaken conception that international law arose together with the origin of the state, divided the stages of its development according to the epochs of the development of human society into the international law of slave-owning society, international law of feudal society, international law of capitalist society, and contemporary international law itself. The coincidence then of all of these concepts makes for a fascinating intersection in the development of modern doctrines of the nation state. The rise of the nation state and modern international relations were also the result of major European conflicts, such as the 100 Years' War, according to which Jonathan Sumption notes, in this dawn of international relations, governments were only beginning to place their relations on a regular footing, to apply themselves continually to the business of keeping their friendship in repair instead of doing so spasmodically and late when the occasion arose. We're talking about then the development of the nation state, and this coincides with the decline of feudalism. But additionally, the 100 Years' War itself would weaken feudal structures by promoting the authority of monarchs, as well as promoting the idea of the national identity of states. Again, quoting Sumption with regard to the English loss of all French territory except for Calais under Henry VI, we see that this is a spectacular shift in fortune for the French towards the end of the 100 Years' War. And what it did was bring an end to 4 centuries of the English dynasty's presence in France, separating 2 countries whose fortunes had been closely intertwined. So that part of the quote is not necessarily too important, but with regard specifically to understanding a separation of national identity, we see that this particular event on its own created a new sense of identity in both of them. In large measure, the divergent fortunes of the French and English states over the following centuries flowed from these events. So it's very hard to underestimate, or shall I say to overestimate, the influence of events like the 100 Years' War when it came to particularly the relationship between England and France. But it should be noted that Scotland and Spain and other European states were also involved in the 100 Years' War at one point or another. But what else contributed to the rise of the nation state and to the Renaissance? Well, you have to remember as well that throughout this entire period, religion is still playing a very important factor. And additional to the development of the nation state through events like the 100 Years' War, we see the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. This facilitated the spread of ideas, including those which challenged the traditional authority of the papacy. Such challenges would crystallize with movements by theologians such as Martin Luther, who challenges the authority of the Catholic Church and contributes to the weakening of the Church's political power in Europe. Don't forget, a mere century before the Reformation and the challenges to the Catholic Church, you have to remember that the papacy is playing a very, very key role in Spanish and Portuguese expansion and colonialism across into the Americas. Coupled with major events like the break from Rome, the English break from Rome in the 1530s, hence why Henry VIII is pictured here on screen, the major shifts in political powers and structures were beginning to take shape. Not only are we seeing a rise of national identity, the rise of the nation state, facilitated by things like the decline in feudalism, events like the 100 Years' War, creating a sense of identity within various different nation states. But we're also seeing the decline in what was historically one of the most important and foundational aspects of the European system within medieval Europe, which is of course religion and the Catholic Church. The weakening of the grip of the Catholic Church over the rest of Europe through the Reformation makes and marks quite significant changes within the history of international law. And so shifting away from looking at world events in its development of the history of international law and going back very quickly to individuals that contribute to international law, I think it's important now, and I think it's time to spend some time talking about Hugo Grotius. Within this traditional change throughout European history, then, the Dutch jurist and philosopher Hugo Grotius was widely regarded as to be one of the foundational figures within the development of this new modern international law. Hugo Grotius was born in 1583 in Delft in the Netherlands and was widely recognized to be a child prodigy. He had entered the University of Leiden, for example, at age just 11. And later became an accomplished scholar, drifting very slowly towards the study of law. In 1625, we see him publishing De Jure Belli Archiparisis, which is one of the groundbreaking works within international law, deeply rooted in natural law traditions. The work, for example, posits that there are universal laws derived from reason which must be applicable to all human beings, regardless of their cultural or political context. The book itself is divided into a number of distinct volumes, speaking on matters concerning the laws of war, the laws of peace, the laws of nations, and principles of natural justice. Perhaps, though, is Hugo Grotius's best-known theory is his theory of a just war, outlining the delineation between what we describe as the right to resort to war, the jus ad bellum, and the right conduct in war, the jus in bello. These are, I'm sure I don't have to explain, two of the most important and foundational principles of international law, at least as it resorts to armed conflict and the resort to force. Essentially, Hugo Grotius delineated the fact that there can be correct actions in war, even if the war itself is not justified in terms of its rationale. So the jus ad bellum concerns the international law concerning the use of force, the rationale for going to war. The jus in bello concerns the actions that are taken when that war has begun, when that war is taking place. And so we sometimes delineate this nowadays between the idea of international law on the use of force on the one hand and international humanitarian law on the other. And essentially you can have a situation where you can have an unjust war with just actions and vice versa, a just war with unjust actions. So, for example, the current Russian invasion of Ukraine is an unjust war. It is a war that is in violation of the jus ad bellum. There are no, the guiding principles of the UN Charter are not invoked in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that is not to suggest that every single person, therefore, who is engaged in war in Ukraine is violating the jus in bello. That is a completely and wholly different characterization and consideration. You can behave correctly in unjust wars, just like you can behave incorrectly in very just wars. Just look, for example, at Allied war crimes during the Second World War. That was an example of a just war, not violating the jus ad bellum, but soldiers individually throughout that conflict would, of course, have committed war crimes and violate the jus in bello in that regard. The work of Grotius is not just extensive and impactful for its contribution to modern international law and principles that we rely on to this day, but it's also authoritative in the ability to have finally excised theology from international law and emphasized the irrelevance in such a study of any conception of a divine law. Grotius, for example, remarked that the law of nature would be valid even if there were no God. So here we can make links and connections back to the previous points that we were talking about when we were referring to the nation state, and we were referring to the Reformation, and we were referring to the weakening of the grip of Catholicism, not just politically within various different states across Europe, but also academically. The weakening of the grip of Catholicism and religious doctrine in all parts of life, this idea of scholasticism in the early medieval period, this idea of the works of Thomas Aquinas essentially creating, should I say, a number of rules and principles of philosophy, theology, and law, all within the concepts of Catholic doctrine and Catholic practices. There was an inherently religious element to basically everything during this scholastic period. All of science was religious, all of law was religious, all of political community was religious. And one of the things that Grotius does is completely detach the concept of the law of nations from the concept of the divine law, the concept of some kind of religious characteristics of the law of nations. He said, like Shaw mentions here, he remarked that the law of nature would be valid even if there were no God. Going back then to the idea of the nation state, we start to see the development of the modern nation state in the period that I examined just a second ago, the end of the 100 Years' War. We start to see the influence of the Renaissance and the Reformation during this sort of 200 or 300 year period that I explored there. But arguably, if individuals such as Grotius and Vittoria represents the backbone of intellectual ideas associated with the development of international law, then we have to start also thinking about the Peace of Westphalia and the development of the modern nation state, because the Peace of Westphalia collectively represents some of the foundations of the institutional development into the establishment of the single most important actor within public international law, that of course being the nation state. So the Peace of Westphalia refers to a series of treaties which were concluded in 1648 and ended both the 30 Years' War as well as the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. Of the various treaties and conclusions that came at the Peace of Westphalia, the two most important of these treaties were the Treaty of Osnabrück, which was signed between the Holy Roman Empire and Sweden, as well as the Treaty of Munster, which was signed between the Holy Roman Empire, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. So the Peace of Westphalia is, of course, very, very important for the conclusion of one of the most bloody conflicts within all of European history, that being the 30 Years' War. And while making a series of things like territorial adjustments between the states involved, the most important feature of the Westphalian Peace was that it was the first move to devise a collective system designed to restrain the powers of sovereign countries and to enforce the law. So essentially, the reason why we have this conclusion about Westphalia is that it formally recognized the sovereignty of individual states. So whereas the idea of the nation state was beginning to emerge during the period of Henry VII and Louis XI and other events like the Reformation and the Renaissance, this developed the idea of the nation state, but the idea of the recognition of sovereignty of individual states, as well as their right to govern without interference from external powers, this came at the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia affirmed the basic principle of sovereignty. Each state would have control over its territory and its internal affairs. As you would have probably guessed, this is a very foundational principle of international law. And embedded within this principle is the idea of non-intervention in internal affairs of another sovereign state, that one state cannot just intervene in the internal affairs of another state for which they have their own sovereignty. It is really for these reasons that we sometimes describe the Peace of Westphalia as the origin of a systemic law. Despite its importance, though, it's important as well that we place a little bit of caution. We must not place too much emphasis on a Eurocentric interpretation of international law's history, as well as B, the concept that international law came to be due to the idea of so-called great men. We've focused on Vittoria, we've focused on Vattel, we've focused on Grotius, and we've focused on Eurocentric events like the Reformation, like the Renaissance, and like the Peace of Westphalia. It should be noted that there are other things that we need to acknowledge as well. And Aland notes in a chapter on the Islamic law of nations that it must be acknowledged that the basic tenets of international law, which hold today, are grounded in the European experience of not only the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, but also the Age of Discovery inaugurated by the voyages of Columbus and da Gama. But, this is the important bit, but it can hardly be maintained in the 21st century that the Spanish school of international law conjured international law into existence. So you could theoretically expand that to a European-centric view of international law. International law didn't just come into existence as the result of this. There are obviously other factors that need to be considered. Aland obviously spends time focusing on the idea of the Islamic law of nations and the place of the Islamic law of nations within the history of international law. It's a very important chapter that I'd recommend you check out. The citation is on the screen. Sometimes it may be said that emphasis is placed on key thinkers and key moments, so Grotius or Westphalia, for example. But if international law is anything, it is the fact that it is international. And so we shouldn't read too much into either great men theories of international history, the idea that international law came because of the great men of Grotius and Vattel and Vittoria, nor should we read into a sort of international law great event theory, that international law came about because of the Reformation, because of the Age of Exploration, because of the Peace of Westphalia. And so moving on a little bit further then, I want to spend some time talking about the long 19th century. Now, the term itself, the long 19th century, refers to a period which spans longer than the actual 19th century. It refers to a period which spans from the start of the French Revolution, which takes place in around 1789, the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, all the way to the onset of the First World War. And it is at this point that we, of course, are going to finish this lecture on the history and move to the development of international law in the modern setting. The term the long 19th century was popularised by British historian Eric Hobsbawm in his 3-volume trilogy on the Age of Revolution, Europe 1789 to 1848, Age of Capital 1848 to 1875, and then the Age of Empire 1875 to 1924. Still very, very prominent and very, very important international histories of the long 19th century that would still be very good recommended reading for anybody studying that period today. The period listed then sees major European events which shape not only the continent, but also, more importantly, shapes the destinies of the rest of the globe through what we will see eventually being a further entrenchment of especially British imperialism, but also other forms of European imperialism. And I want to begin by thinking about the French Revolution and Napoleon. In terms of events which were transformative, then, the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and the wars which bear his name, as well as the subsequent Congress of Vienna, all come to mind as very transformative events in the long 19th century. So, at the beginning at the start of the actual 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars began in 1803, and they stretched all the way through to 1815. They were essentially a series of conflicts involving Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire against a range of European coalitions. Fundamentally, the French Revolution itself, which took place and preceded the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon came to power after the French Revolution and after the Reign of Terror, but the French Revolution overturned what was known as the Ancien Régime in France.
Now, what's quite interesting here for a little bit of a literary interpretation is that the word ancien itself is just French for old, or French for ancient. And as such, an ancien regime, while also denoting a very specific period of French history, which was overthrown by the Revolution, may also denote any such political system or political structure which was replaced by another. And so the expansion of the French Empire and the establishment of the continental system under Napoleon's rule could easily be described as a system overthrowing an old or an ancien regime. During Napoleon's reign, for example, as emperor, the Holy Roman Empire, one of the oldest political systems in European history, had been effectively dissolved. This was an overthrowing of a sort of international or a sort of European ancien system. But Napoleon was ultimately not successful, and of course suffered defeats at the hand first of the Russians under Alexander I and then to the British. And this is where we get to the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna was a diplomatic conference which was held from September 1814 to June 1815. And it ultimately aimed at restoring Europe's political order after the fall of Napoleon. Don't forget, the French Revolution took place in the 1780s, was a quite turbulent event, but was relatively contained in terms of the sort of overspill. But then events like the Reign of Terror would become very, very prevalent in terms of European history, and Napoleon would become a major factor in major European wars from the sort of 1800s all the way to 1815. So we're going through quite a long period of instability during this history. And so the Congress of Vienna was an important attempt to restore Europeans' political order after the fall of Napoleon. Its principal aim was to restore the balance of power in Europe. The formation of what would then become the Concert of Europe, which was a cooperative framework in which major powers agreed to periodic consultations to preserve European stability, went very, very far towards this goal. The Congress of Vienna, for example, was described by Randall Lassafer as not only holding pride of place for having achieved a new political and legal order of Europe that would last for over half a century, but also much quoted for having given birth to the first multilateral codifications of international law. So we're starting to really see international law in a way that we see international law to this day. You sort of have hints of international legal principles that we think of today with the writings of Vattel and Vittoria and Grotius back previously, things like the Jus ad bellum and the Jus in bello. But coming towards the long 19th century, coming past the Congress of Vienna, we can see that there is clearly the growth of the first multilateral codifications of international law. But the Congress of Vienna didn't just have European implications. It was also the first time that we see the condemnation of the Atlantic slave trade. It is condemned as contrary to the principles of humanity. The 1815 Vienna Declaration notes that, quote, having taken into consideration that the commerce, known by the name of the slave trade, has been considered by just and enlightened men of all ages as repugnant to the principles of humanity and universal morality. And so, this is undoubtedly a correct statement about what the Atlantic slave trade ultimately was, and this is undoubtedly a positive step towards the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery more generally. But it is in this Vienna Declaration that I've cited here that I want to use this to draw us back to our underlying assumption about the historical development of international law, especially the historical development of international law as existing in the shadow of imperialism. The abolition of slavery in this regard forms part of an increasingly important delineation which begins to exist between the so-called civilized and the uncivilized. Now, we noted this briefly when we talked about the sort of the ability for the Christian community to dominate the non-Christians, and we cited that this was a sort of dichotomy that was beginning to grow between Christian and non-Christian.
and that this all fundamentally boils down to the delineation between the civilized and the uncivilized, the civilized and the barbaric. The Declaration makes explicit reference to the civilized country, suggesting the existence of the negation, suggesting the existence of the uncivilized. In this regard, then, according to Suvala, the abolition of slavery was another principal condition for achieving civilized status. Pursuant to an initiative of Lord Castlereagh, the Congress of Vienna issued the Declaration on the Abolition of the Slave Trade. We've noted that as we cited just a second ago, which stated that the public voice in all civilized countries calls aloud for slavery's prompt suppression. Now, viewing the slave trade and viewing slave trade abolition as a precondition for achieving a status of civilized, for achieving the status of civilized, opens the door to understanding the relationship between the European and the rest of the world through the lens of this dynamic, through the lens of this sort of dichotomy. The collective unity of imperial powers in Europe, through the agreement of mutual cooperation, established a peaceful competition for imperial expansion. The target of this imperial expansion, well, the target would, of course, be Africa. And so the scramble for Africa, as we get towards the late 1800s, refers to a period of colonial history between 1880 and 1914, where we see the rapid colonization and partition of Africa by European powers. There are a number of drivers for this shift to the east, away from the colonization of the Americas. First, you have the independence of America in the late 1700s. But one of the main desires, of course, is the desire for new raw materials. The operationalization of the scramble for Africa arguably begins with the Berlin Conference between 1884 and 1885, which had been convened by Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor. The conference, inter alia, concluded that colonial claims required more than just declarations of claims. It required more than just saying, I own this part of territory. Instead, it required something known as effective occupation of the territory itself. Now, for a number of jurists and people who are now really firmly thinking about understanding a system of law that exists between nations, a system of international law, this new wave of imperialism posed some difficulties for the theory of law and for the theory of the law of nations. The reason for this is because jurists for many centuries, up to this point, had conceded that there are just causes for war and therefore are just causes for conquest. But remarkably few argued that European empires presented any of those causes. For the most part, the big names within international law, in terms of its history, the Grotius, the Vatels, and all these people, they were pretty condemnatory about old imperialism that we see with the Age of Discovery and the conquest of the Americas. They didn't see a way of justifying this practice through the basic ideas of natural rights theory and international law and international legal theory. So how does one then go about justifying even more expansion, even more imperialism by carving up Africa and imperial expansion into this part of the world? How could this ever be possibly described as potentially just? Well, Fitzmaurice argues that the interplay of previously existing arguments from people like Vittoria, as well as new ideas of the sort of civilized and uncivilized dichotomy, provided what I've described here in my notes as a sort of Frankenstein amalgamation of arguments to justify colonization through occupation. Noting here on screen this idea of effective occupation. The concept of occupation would become a very important part of juristic theory, in part due to its contribution to this civilized versus uncivilized dichotomy. According then to Fitzmaurice, Vittoria's defence of non-European societies, which we noted at the start of this lecture, was easily inverted as an attack. If a measure of a just society was whether it had understood and exploited the laws of nature, it was merely possible to reverse the description of non-European peoples from being civil, from having occupied their territory, to being savage. Savage or barbarian people did not understand natural law. They sinned against it, and they did not therefore occupy the land upon which they lived. So if they were thinking about trying to view the justification of imperialism through the works of writers who fundamentally argued that such acts were unjust or could not be seen to have fit within the framework of international law of nations that they had begun to develop, well, then they began to just flip it on its head. Ultimately, then, occupying land became an integral part of a just society. Fitzmaurice goes into great length then talking about the writings of John Locke, for example, and the sort of ideas of property and ownership of property within his political theory. But fundamentally, occupying land then becomes an integral part of a just society, something that sets the civilized Europeans apart from the uncivilized barbarians. And it wasn't just the sort of factual reality of occupying land. It was the ability to occupy land. It was not the case that these theorists and that these ideas argued that non-Europeans or the barbaric or the uncivilized peoples were just not occupying lands. It was that they were unable to occupy lands, and it was sort of created a sort of very, very contradictory feedback loop, where the ability to occupy land was a foundational principle of a just society, something that was not only desired but also sought after. A just society was one which had the ability to occupy its land. So if you can conclude, therefore, that the non-European peoples are uncivilized in one way or another, or barbaric in one way or another, then it must be the case that they cannot occupy their land. But this principle extends to a desire on the part of European empires to expand their territory through colonialism. Again, Fitzmaurice notes that the debate over the justice of empire increasingly focused on precisely what constituted occupation. We sort of dial in away from thinking about all of the unjust elements of colonialism, all the unjust elements of domination, and we just think, well, okay, what constitutes occupation? Let's think about occupation more generally, and owning land and occupying, being on land. By the time of the first professional body of international jurists was established in 1873, just a little bit before the scramble for Africa, the efforts to codify international law led to a taxonomy of occupation, which included not only the idea of res nullius, but also territorium nullius and terra nullius. Each of these terms was employed in order to distinguish the particular conditions in which occupation may be possible, and also to distinguish different possible degrees of occupation. So we get very, very convoluted about the idea of occupation, about what occupation means. And then, as noted earlier, when we go back to the idea of the Berlin Conference, they formally codified the so-called legality of effective occupation as the foundation of European powers to make claims to territories. Essentially, we developed what appears to be convoluted ways to justify the existence of self-perception of European ideal as just and civilized, while using those exact same tools to justify domination and conquering of other peoples. The conquest of Africa then represents, as a result of this, one of the high watermark periods of imperialism, notably the immense size of the British Empire. Was quite starkly pronounced at this time, and by extension, and as a consequence of this, was also one of the darkest periods of imperialism, with events such as the Boer Wars, the Belgian treatment of peoples in the Congo, the establishment of racist settler colonial states such as South Africa and Rhodesia, and really too much more to even mention in this lecture. By the turn of the century then, and importantly for our purposes, by the turn of the end of the long 19th century, the discourse of occupation and imperialism begins to shift further. Now, this is something that we're going to get to, and we'll have to get to in more detail in the next lecture. But according again to Koskiniemi, by 1914, occupation was no longer seen as an instrumental part of civilizing mission. There was an implicit sense that the civilizing mission had come to naught. The colonial question was transformed into a balance of power problem, in which there was scarcely room for philanthropic or humanitarian ideals. And so as we come to the end of this lecture on the history of international law, and we start thinking about in the next lecture the rise of modern international law and the modern international legal system, it is worth noting that the question of imperialism does not in fact disappear. In the next lecture, we are going to examine the modern development of international law, and in doing so, we have to discuss a number of issues, such as the growing concern of decolonization partially after the end of the First World War with the sort of League of Mandates system, but then mostly at the end of the Second World War. We'll have to talk about the League of Nations itself. We'll have to talk about the mandate system. But then we have to go into the period of the Cold War, and then the period after the Cold War, and start thinking about events and shifts and changes in international law during that time period. The 1990s is a very important period in the development of international law. And what you'll probably find, in concluding and watching both of these lectures together, you'll find that the majority of the rules and the institutions and the treaties and the ideas of international law that you are familiar with today come from this modern period. All of the period that I've explored here develops some of the foundational principles of international law, some of the sort of bedrock ideas, but things like the United Nations, things like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, things like the World Trade Organization or the International Criminal Court or the Security Council, all of those different kinds of things, they begin to emerge after the end of the Second World War, during what Hobsbawm describes as the very short 20th century. The divide then between the history of international law prior to World War I and the international law since World War I has a number of implications. One such implication is the institutionalization of international law. As we've noted in this lecture, until World War I, world affairs were to a large extent influenced by periodic conferences that were held in Europe, things like the Congress of Vienna, things like the Westphalian Peace Conference, things like the Berlin Conference, for example, all of which were the sort of foundational principles that drove the development of international law. The shift in the world order since the Great War, though, sees the establishment of the first international institutions, and we're going to spend a great amount of time talking about those international institutions in the next lecture.